The global financial system has been dominated by the US dollar for decades, but potential shift in the global power dynamics is on the horizon. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are increasingly making moves to challenge the dollar's dominance and reduce their reliance on it for trade and financial transactions. This coalition of emerging economies is exploring alternative payment systems and even a new currency to further reduce their dependence on the US dollar. As this shift progresses, former President Donald Trump has escalated the situation by warning the BRICS nations that if they attempt to develop a new currency or reduce their dependence on the dollar, the U.S. will impose massive tariffs on them 100%, and in some cases, even up to 150%. This harsh rhetoric has raised significant questions about the future of global trade, the potential consequences for both BRICS nations and the United States, and the long-term ramifications for the international financial system. The BRICS coalition, a challenge to the dollar? The BRICS countries, individually and collectively, represent a substantial portion of global economic power. As of 2025, this bloc represents over 40% of the world's population and accounts for a significant share of global GDP. Together, they have become increasingly vocal about their desire to create an alternative financial system that does not rely on the US dollar. For decades, the US dollar has served as the primary global reserve currency, facilitating trade, investment, and the international exchange of goods and services. This dominance has allowed the U.S. to wield significant influence over global finance. However, with rising geopolitical tensions and economic shifts, BRICS nations have become more interested in reducing their reliance on the dollar. There are various reasons behind this desire. Geopolitical independence. Countries like Russia and China view dollar dominance as a tool of U.S. geopolitical influence. By moving away from the dollar, they hope to reduce the U.S.'s ability to exert political pressure through economic sanctions and other financial mechanisms. Russia, for instance, has been heavily sanctioned by the U.S. due to its involvement in the Ukraine conflict and other geopolitical tensions. Economic diversification. India, Brazil, and South Africa are also interested in currency diversification. Their economies are highly integrated into the global supply chain, and a move away from the dollar could give them more control over their financial systems and reduce vulnerability to currency fluctuations tied to the US dollar. Financial innovation. In addition to these geopolitical and economic factors, BRICS nations have also considered the possibility of developing a shared currency or financial system to further reduce dependence on the dollar. Russia and China have explored various alternatives, including using their own currencies, such as the ruble and the yuan, in trade deals, bypassing the US dollar entirely. For instance, China has been particularly proactive in using the yuan as a regional alternative to the dollar. It has signed agreements with multiple countries to settle trade transactions in yuan rather than dollars, particularly in energy deals. Russia, on the other hand, has been exploring the possibility of creating a new global financial system through initiatives like the BRICS Bank, which could provide loans and facilitate trade outside of the dollar-dominated system. While these efforts are still in the early stages, they have the potential to reshape global finance. The idea of a BRICS-backed currency, a common payment system, or even a gold-backed trade mechanism has gained significant attention. The idea of creating an alternative to the US dollar is no longer a fringe idea, but a serious consideration among the BRICS nations. Trump's 100% tariff threat, a bold strategy or political posturing. In response to growing BRICS efforts to challenge the dollar, former President Donald Trump issued a remarkable threat. He vowed to impose a 100% tariff on all BRICS nations unless they abandon their plans to develop a new currency and reduce their reliance on the US dollar. The tariffs could escalate further to as much as 150%, according to reports from Washington. This threat represents a dramatic shift in U.S. trade policy. While tariffs have long been a tool of U.S. trade policy, they have typically been used to target specific countries or industries, such as the trade war between the U.S. and China. This time, however, Trump's threat is aimed at an entire bloc of countries, BRICS, that has united in its pursuit of a financial system independent of the U.S. dollar. Trump's warning has been met with anger and surprise, both within the BRICS nations and the broader global community. The economic ramifications of such tariffs would be devastating. The BRICS nations account for a substantial portion of global production and trade, and a tariff war with these countries would have far-reaching consequences. Economic contraction. Analysts have warned that imposing tariffs of such magnitude would likely trigger a severe global recession, with BRICS countries accounting for more than 40% of the world's population and a significant share of global trade. Cutting off these countries from the U.S. economic sphere would disrupt global supply chains and severely impact U.S. consumers. Many American companies rely on countries like China, India, and Brazil for their supply chains, and a 100% or 150% tariff could cause prices for raw materials, electronics, food, and textiles to skyrocket. Inflation and economic stagnation. The U.S. economy could experience significant inflation as a result of these tariffs. Consumer prices could rise sharply, and the cost of living could increase, putting a strain on American households. Furthermore, the possibility of a broader economic downturn would make it difficult for U.S. companies to remain competitive, particularly in industries that rely on affordable imports from BRICS countries. Retaliation from BRICS. Retaliation from BRICS nations could escalate the situation further. China, in particular, is already in the midst of a trade war with the U.S., and any further escalation could lead to a complete breakdown in U.S.-China relations. India, too, has been increasingly critical of U.S. trade policies, although it has been careful not to alienate the U.S. completely. Brazil and South Africa may follow suit, leading to a cascade of retaliatory tariffs that could destabilize global markets. Will BRICS nations unite or divide? The underlying tension here is whether the BRICS nations will remain united in their pursuit of a common currency or financial system, or whether they will fracture under external pressure. There are significant divisions within BRICS, particularly between China and India, which have a long-standing border dispute. Russia's geopolitical isolation, due in part to the ongoing war in Ukraine, also makes a more radical player in the BRICS coalition. Despite these internal divisions, the external pressure from Trump's threat could serve to unify the BRICS nations. If the U.S. continues to aggressively target them, it could push the countries closer together, with a shared goal of reducing dependence on the dollar and asserting their financial independence. Brazil and South Africa have also expressed support for questioning the U.S. dollar's dominance. Brazil's president, for example, has openly stated that trade in national currencies, rather than the dollar, could benefit BRICS countries, particularly in agriculture and raw materials. South Africa, which is a major exporter of minerals, especially gold, sees the dollar's dominance as an unnecessary burden on its trade relationships. India, however, remains somewhat hesitant. While it has increasingly looked to diversify its currency usage, including paying for oil in rupees, it is also careful not to alienate its relationship with the U.S., which remains one of its most important trade partners. India's strategy appears to be one of gradual diversification, rather than a full-scale departure from the dollar-based system. The potential consequences of a global trade war. Should Trump follow through with his threat and impose 100% or 150% tariffs on BRICS nations, the consequences would be catastrophic for both the U.S. and BRICS countries. Economists have warned that such an escalation could lead to the disruption of trade between the U.S. and BRICS nations would lead to a significant reduction in global trade flows. Given that BRICS countries account for a considerable share of global GDP and production, this could trigger a recession in both the U.S. and globally. U.S. consumers would face skyrocketing prices for a range of goods, from electronics to food to raw materials. The cost of goods imported from BRICS countries would rise sharply, leading to inflationary pressures on American households. U.S. companies that rely on BRICS nations for trade and supply chains would be severely impacted. The tariffs would make U.S. goods more expensive in BRICS markets, potentially leading to a loss of market share for American firms in key sectors. Could BRICS establish a new reserve currency? Despite the many obstacles to creating a unified BRICS-backed currency, the bloc is still moving forward with plans to reduce its reliance on the U.S. dollar. A BRICS-backed currency, while unlikely in the short term, remains a long-term goal for the group. Countries like Russia and China have already begun experimenting with alternative trade mechanisms, such as yuan-ruble trade agreements and the use of national currencies in bilateral trade deals. India, Brazil, and South Africa are exploring the possibility of using their own currencies in trade agreements with BRICS partners. This will allow them to bypass the dollar and reduce their vulnerability to U.S. financial policies. However, creating a truly global alternative to the U.S. dollar is no small task. It would require widespread adoption and overcoming the political and economic challenges of unifying diverse economies within the BRICS framework. Trump's threat of 100% to 150% tariffs on BRICS countries is a bold and unprecedented move. While it may seem like political posturing, it underscores the growing tensions between the U.S. and the BRICS nations over the future of global finance and trade. If Trump follows through with these tariffs, the consequences for global trade could be dire. BRICS countries, for their part, have made it clear that they will not bow to U.S. pressure. They view the U.S. as trying to maintain a monopoly on global trade and finance, and they are increasingly determined to explore alternatives. Whether they succeed in developing a new financial system or currency remains to be seen, but the global trade system is at a crossroads. In the end, this conflict could have far-reaching consequences for both the U.S. and BRICS countries. A shift away from the dollar could erode the U.S.'s financial power and lead to greater economic diversification globally. However, the road to de-dollarization is fraught with challenges, and the path forward will depend on how both sides navigate this high-stakes confrontation. The global economy stands on the precipice of significant change, and the outcome of this trade war will likely shape the future of global finance for years to come. Will the U.S. successfully preserve its dollar-dominated financial system, or will BRICS nations find a way to challenge it? Only time will tell, but one thing is certain: the stakes have never been higher.